Welcome. It's great to be back, and thank you for inviting me. This is certainly a meaty topic. Before I get going, I do just want to, thank the fact that, so I'm going to get into some sort of heavy topics and ask for some changes, but also just want to acknowledge that incredible work that has been accomplished, especially through the leadership that you've offered here, Chair Speakman. And the speaker has really, I think, made this a priority, and the fact is that this commission exists as a demonstration of that priority. So without further ado.
And before you start, I'm sorry, you know it's the practice of the commissioners to feel free to interrupt the presenters with questions. I assume you welcome that as well?
Well, I am hoping, despite our precedent, that we might be able to hold questions to the end. Okay. This is sort of the agenda, but I certainly defer to you.
We will try.
Okay. So the goal is to combat the myth that recent investments of housing have been slow to produce units, equip committee members with information to debunk that myth, and we're going to do that through a real development project, kind of using a case study of a real development project to demonstrate what it costs, how long it takes, and what we could do differently. So do some quick level setting, then we'll go into the case study of this project called Center City Apartments, and then time for Q&A. As I mentioned, this is a pretty dense topic, so if we can't cover all the questions, or if this kind of raises other topics you'd like to dive into, here's my contact information. So we talk about developing. I just want to kind of confirm with everyone that we have three ways of developing affordable housing. First, we can protect what already exists by purchasing existing housing and placing a long-term deed restriction on the property to ensure affordability. The top left-hand corner is a picture of Sutton Place. That's an example of protecting naturally occurring affordable housing. Secondly, we can preserve affordable housing by renovating and extending affordability, usually for projects that are more than 20 years old. So the top right picture is a picture of a project called Elmwood Neighborhood Revitalization that we recently preserved. And then the bottom picture is a photo of Broad Street Homes in Central Pulse. Josh knows that project well. And this is an example of producing new or adaptively reusing existing properties for housing. So three ways that we develop housing. So the term affordable is actually a relative term, right? But affordable with a capital A, if you will, it means that a resident does not pay more than 1/3 of their gross income, meaning rent and utility costs, in housing. So it's relative because it really depends on how much your income that you have. There are 4 very precise terms of affordability, and this is dictated by HUD. Extremely low income, very low income, and moderate income. And then here are the current income maximums per segmentation of affordability. So there's a few math problems I'm going to go through. The first math problem is that operating quality housing costs more than extremely low income households can afford to pay in rent. So one neighborhood builder's average per year operating expense is about $9,500. That's for insurance and property taxes, water, sewer, maintenance, compliance, replacement reserves. So that's just what it costs to keep the lights on. If you are disabled and receiving SSI, and you probably are going to be getting about $910 a month on SSI, that qualifies you as being extremely low income. If we use the ratio of about 1/3 of your income in housing costs, that allows you to pay rent of about $300 a month. As you can clearly see, that without a rental subsidy, a person is really, a landlord is going to be impossible to be able to provide rent at such a low amount. Even the most magnanimous and generous landlord really can't do that without a rental subsidy because you simply can't keep the lights on. A second math problem. There's very little income left over after paying those operating expenses to use towards a mortgage. So again, with the example of about $9,500 a year just to keep the lights on, Let's just say we are renting an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, for $1,190 a month. That is what we currently are renting. So after paying for those monthly operating expenses, we have about $400 left over our net operating income. Generally, banks want to see a 1.2 debt service coverage ratio. Right now, we're seeing about 8% interest rates. All that factor in, we really are only able to bring on a mortgage of $1.8 million. So I just want to sort of note that, again, the math really doesn't work. You can't just build buildings or affordable housing exclusively with debt. You have to have capital grants because of the limited net operating income. So how do we fill the gap? The first source that I'm going to talk about are those soft sources, otherwise known as capital grants. So I bucketed them out into 3 categories. First, the predictable soft sources. So this is like our federal home money, our federal housing trust funds, our state housing production fund, and just wanted to note that some municipalities also have their own home, like the city of Providence. As Emily was here, she could talk about that. So the amount of money, Rhode Island gets about $5 million a year in home, about $2 million a year in housing trust funds, and given our conveyance tax, we generate about $8 million a year in the state housing production fund. Then there's our semi-predictable bucket of money. So Rhode Island Housing has been very successful in obtaining the Capital Magnet Fund and hope that they will continue to be successful, but that is not necessarily predictable. They have utilized their own resources to have an acquisition or revitalization program. And again, they've used their own resources for this middle income program, and Amy could, I'm sure, elaborate on that. And then there's these not predictable but vital sources. So BHRI, our bond fund, has been incredibly vital, but of course it's not predictable. It depends on if we put it out to voters and what they decide. And then there's been this, temporary deluge of ARPA funds, which has been terrific, and I really applaud the governor and the speaker for making the investment in housing with those ARPA funds, but certainly that's not predictable. And then there is this second kind of way we fill the gap. And that is LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. I'm just going to say that it's pretty much impossible, or it has generally been impossible, to produce affordable housing at scale without using low-income housing tax credits. So there's 2 types. There's the 9% and the 4%. Rhode Island receives a small state allocation. Us, I think Delaware, maybe Hawaii, receives a small state minimum, which is $3 million in annual credits from the federal government. So it's a 10-year credit, so you multiply that by 10 years. So we got $30 million we're working with. So what you have to do is you add up all the expenses that you're allowed to use with low-income housing tax credit equity. That's called the qualified basis. Add that all up, and you can take 9% of it. But any one development in Rhode Island cannot receive more than 40% of the state's allocation. So you might have more basis than you can actually take because Rhode Island has capped that at 40%. Very reasonable. It's not a criticism. It's just is what it is. And that is $1.2 million. So then you have $1.2 million of tax credits, and you sell it to investors. The amount of money you can get ebbs and flows. Right now, it's only about 90 cents. A few years ago, it was like 94. There was even a time in our history where you could get like $1.03. People were paying more because of a variety of reasons. But right now, it's about 90 cents. So 90 cents times $1.2 million is, over the 10 years, is $10 million of equity. So that's what we have as a source. Then there's the 4%. And you pair that with a private activity bond, You can only get 4% of the qualified basis, so a lot less. But there's no maximum, so you can generate much more equity, if you will, but less proportionally. This is when I refer back to that slide with the exclamation mark. Call me later, we'll talk more. So unpredictability and scarcity results in standstill. So developers, be they for-profit or not-for-profit, are really reluctant to spend time and money when development capital is not predictable or challenging to obtain. That's just really important to remember. So want to talk a little bit about how we come up with projects and the trade-offs and challenges that project selection presents. So the questions that we have to ask is scale. How many apartments can we fit here? Zoning, can we build it multifamily by right? Is it even available? Is the title clouded? Is it really hard to obtain? The location, is it near RIPTA and schools? Is the property constrained by easements or wetlands, contamination, historic, or ledge? As you can see, the winnowing process happens. Will the acquisition cost be about $25,000 per year, or per unit rather? That's been kind of a rule of thumb on how much we generally can afford. And then of course there's mission, right? Will it be a transformative project? Will it provide a new amenity? How does it advance our mission? So I'm going to use this as a case study to talk about how we arrived at this selection and how we handle the finances. This is Center City Apartments. It will be our largest development to date. These are renderings of the development. Actually, let me go to this first. So there's 144 apartments in total here. It is going to have a range of incomes from extremely low to moderate income. 40% of the apartments will be permanent supportive housing, or 57 of those apartments. And then the rest will just be for low to moderate income families. There will be studio 1, 2, 3 bedroom apartments. There'll be green space and porch, lots of on-site offices for our partners from Crossroads, Family Services, and Foster Forward. There's a RIPTA bus spot literally right in front of the development, and will feature energy efficiency. So I'm actually going to go back to the prior slide for a second. So this met most of that project selection criteria. It definitely has a lot of scale. There's 3 parcels on 3 acres and 1 existing building. It did not necessarily, it wasn't by right. So we actually had to receive some zoning relief. And when we went in with our original project, we ended up having to lose 16 apartments. We initially had proposed 160, and the zoning board asked us to reduce the number of units to 144, so we have enough parking, and they asked us to remove the ground floor childcare. So that was quite disappointing. We were planning on having Head Start classrooms. So just an example of the challenge of zoning and the back and forth process. It was a hefty price tag, $4.5 million. When we had 160 apartments there, we were really close to our goal of $25,000 per unit. It was at 27. When we shrank the unit count, of course, the per unit price went up. So now we're at $31,400 per unit, a little high for us. There was connection to city water and sewer, which is great. The soil conditions are not terrible, nice. And then I mentioned we've got this terrific partners that we're doing this project with. So it certainly meets mission.
This is in East Province, is that right?
That's right, sorry, yes, it's in East Province on Taunton Avenue.
Yes.
Can you just explain what the rationale is for requiring you to remove the child care facility? Seems kind of surprising.
The parking, that they were worried that we would, suggested that residents are going to be gone during the day, and the parking could sort of have a dual purpose, so we didn't have to have a whole bunch more parking for parents and staff, and they didn't agree with that. So they were going to require us to have adequate parking for the childcare, and then we'd have to reduce the units even more.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Vice Chair Drum.
Thank you. On one of the previous slides, can you just illustrate the difference between the 40% of apartments that will be permanent supportive housing versus the 60% for low to moderate income households?
No, excellent question. So the permanent supportive housing will be for extremely low income households, so that less than 30% of area median income. It will also not just being households who are extremely low income, but generally they require supportive services in order to maintain their leases. Behavioral health, et cetera, kind of challenges. Thank you. So here is our calendar, or our timeline of activities. So back in June of 2022, we found this parcel of land, and we made an option payment to secure it and take it off the market. That's the $175,000. We conducted feasibility analysis to see whether this was going to be a viable project. So that's the timeline, spent about 3 months on that, $50,000. Then we negotiated site control, which took quite a bit of time. And we put some more money down on the option payment. And then we applied for an acquisition loan, and we purchased the property, and we applied for pre-development funding. And that's the purchase price there, net of the option payments. And then we did a bunch of design and engineering work. We went to the planning and zoning boards and got their approvals, identified lenders and investors. That pretty much brings us up to where we are today. And that design and engineering and the work that we needed to do for planning and zoning boards cost about $1.5 million. So now we are in the stage of preparing and submitting our financing applications, and we'll be then awaiting a decision. We anticipate the applications being due like the middle of January, and we'll hear in May. And that's the cost for submitting the application. And then all during this time, between when we purchase the property in March and when we find out whether we're receiving financing, we're carrying the building. We're paying taxes, insurance, and financing on our loans, and that's about $125,000. So this is 2 years that represents a period of time where we're doing a whole bunch of work, and we don't know whether we're going to have an exit strategy. We don't know if we're going to get funding. And we've spent $6.4 million without knowing whether we're going to get financing. Then, after, cross fingers, we get an affirmative decision in May, we'll then go back to our architects and engineers and say, bring us all the way to 100% construction documents. We'll go back to the planning department to get final plan approval, and we'll work on getting our firm commitment of financing. So that's about 6 months of work and about another $1.1 million. Then we'll work with our legal counsel to close on financing. Legal is not cheap. It's about $155,000 in another 3 months. And meanwhile, we've got our carrying costs. It's about another $50,000. So another 9 months and another $1.3 million. That's, nearly 3 years, 33 months before a shovel hits the ground. And that, notably, is the best case scenario, because we get the thumbs up in May on everything. So, as mentioned, I really do want to recognize the incredible work of this commission, the Land Use Commission, and the speaker's leadership in getting some improvements in the zoning. So the zoning that was passed last session that's going into effect this winter, the changes here that I highlighted, just 3, there's a lot more than this, but 3 that I thought were pertinent. It was really hard to use a special use permit provision, and if we had been able to do that, it would have really helped us. So I applaud this change that's happening in 2024. There's no unified development review process. We could have definitely benefited from that, but those who come after us will be able to now, and really had very strict dimensional variances, and this new law allows some modifications to that. So the use of funds. there's lots of acronyms. People like to say TDC. So our total development cost, or TDC here, is $57.2 million. Clearly, the construction is the largest slice of the pie at $43.8 million. When you take the total development cost and divide it by the 144 apartments, the per unit development cost is just shy of $400,000. That might strike you as expensive, but it is actually not in this environment. So the low, I would say this is actually a relatively low per unit development cost due to the economies of scale. So notably, last year in Rhode Island Housing's application process, the per unit TDC for the 10 projects that they funded was $397,500. But that included projects that were just getting moderate rehab, right? They were not ground up construction, not gut rehabs. There were some units that were just being moderately rehabbed. So the average, obviously, was lowered considerably. So the other slices of the pie here: acquisition, architect and engineering, financing and reserves, the fee that we earn, other soft costs. So that's how, those are kind of the general slices of the pie that you'll see in any deal. So this is how we're going to pay for it. And if your mind sort of explodes, I can understand that. There's 21 different and prospective sources that we are cobbling together. Our capital stack, as they say, is like a very, very tall, leaning Tower of Pisa. So if you were to lump them into categories, the most significant category is private equity of just shy of $25 million. That's the proceeds from selling our low-income housing tax credits. ARPA, $15.5 million. Debt, $10.5 million. And again, the debt is relatively small because we don't have that much NOI after paying our costs and wanting to keep our rents reasonable. Federal sources of $3.3 million. State, it's only $2 million. And then other of $609,000. So this pie chart, I left it in here just to show, like, wow, there's a lot of slices. And it really, you see the percentages here for each of them. And you recognize that there's got to be a better way. So it's a very dynamic process. Source selection is an art and a science. We end up having to back into the sources based on what's available and how to be most competitive. While, of course, trying to maintain our vision for the project, which is sometimes hard because you have to, flex to what's available. So some sources are targeted to certain geographies. For instance, only in qualified census tracts or transit-oriented development districts. Some sources are only available for certain AMI levels, only for extremely low or moderate income. And then there's these rules around the maximum source per subsidy. For instance, $80,000 per unit is eligible for the middle income source, but not more than $1 million per development for capital magnet fund. Again, very reasonable, not a criticism. It's just that that's where this art and science comes into play. And these sources will invariably change once the 2024 Qualified Action Plan is released any day now. So a word about the ARPA money. Everyone, I think, knows and has heard a million times. Well, Rhode Island received, the governor and the speaker, historic investment in affordable housing. Absolutely, there is no doubt about that. Very historic, unprecedented investment of $250 million. But I just do want to note that the bolded items are actually for production. The other items, while worthy and ancillary, weren't actually for production. So 161.5 million was actually, as I said, designated for affordable housing development. And initially, you may recall that they were throttled over 3 years. So they weren't all available right away. That has been rectified, and now they're all available, but that was an initial impediment. They wanted to push it over 3 years. There have been limits placed on how much can be invested in any one project. So we really can't proceed until all the sources are secured. Just a kind of reminder here too, that in this past year, everyone knows this, but interest rates have really increased. And so we can take even less debt than we had originally anticipated, going from 6.5% to 8% just in the last several months. And our low-income housing tax credit pricing has decreased from 93 to 90 or 89 cents. So the same development requires more money than it did a year ago. And that is a fact. And unfortunately, while construction costs, we've seen a little bit of a softening and a decrease in some of the construction costs, but not commensurately with the increase in interest rates and the decreasing of LIHTC pricing.
We have a question from Rep. Giroux.
Please.
Can you just shed some light as to what factors go into the low-income housing tax credit decreasing from the 93 to 89? Like what influences that, please?
So investors have to anticipate the yield that they're going to get, and if they also participate on the lending side, generally investors want to also purchase your construction loan, and if they are now borrowing from like the Fed at a higher rate, then they have to, they make less money on the loan side, and so then they can give you less on the equity side. And there's all sorts of other pieces to it that are, honestly, I don't fully understand.
Go right ahead, I think. Yep.
So last math problem. So, and this is a tough one, but gotta say it. So calculating the number of units produced can be flawed and misleading. When we think about taking a number like we have, as an example, let's just say, Rhode Island may be able to only produce 70 units for $10 million of ARPA, where maybe New York can produce 125 units for the same amount of money. Like, why is that? It's because they have more state sources to leverage the ARPA with. They can stretch it farther. So this production by source ratio is inflated in communities where there are ample sources to serve as leverage. So, and I should also note that we should all look out when there's an inclination to double count units produced over successive funding awards. And Representative Chippendale, may I try to elaborate? You look like you're like, I don't understand that. Is that making sense? Or okay. Okay. So I think there's just a leverage or expediency. So which do we want? Because we can't have it both ways. And quality or quantity, we kind of can't have that both ways either. Cost containment is really a very worthy objective and one that we're incredibly mindful of, but at the same time, quality wages for subcontractors, energy efficiency in design, the provision of housing for extremely low-income households that may require seeding some operating reserves. These are all important objectives as well. So my final two slides are some key takeaways. Developers start projects when there are predictable funding sources. Without predictability, it's really hard to start getting going. The opportunities to shrink the capital stack will make projects move more quickly. When you've got 21 sources, it elongates the timeline. Recent zoning updates will shave time off the process. Again, wonderful changes that were occurring. The risk is fully borne by developers. It takes about 2 years to know if a project will receive funding. It takes hundreds of thousands, if not more than $1 million, to position a project to be competitive for full financing. You're investing a lot of money to hopefully get to a yes. When ARPA funding is fully obligated, which will occur by the end of next year, a question that should be keeping us all up at night is what will fill that hole? Without a replacement source, the verifiable pipeline of affordable housing projects will grind to a halt. So what can we do? We cannot go backwards. We absolutely cannot go backwards. We've made progress, and everyone is talking about housing, and everyone is doing stuff about housing, so we cannot go backwards. We've got to continue with this momentum. We have to champion significant and consistent investments in housing production each and every year, using all the tools at our disposal. State and municipal bonds, direct budget allocation, this new state low-income housing tax credit, again, applaud the Department of Housing and the governor for making that possible. Incentivize municipalities to proactively identify sites for housing and partner with developers to get it done. I really think that we can celebrate realistic and measurable progress made in every city and town, and I think there's a way of doing that and partnering with cities and towns. Last math problem that I won't ask you to do, but Massachusetts, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. And you ended with the question I was going to ask about the size of the bond, which was sort of just one of the sources here. So thank you for that. Questions?